Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to our webinar for the new Global Internal Audit Standards Update. My name is Sophie Hall and I'm Sectors and Communities Manager for ACCA UK. I'm delighted to welcome Anne Brooke of Chartered IIA as our speaker today. Anne is the Head of Technical Content and Research at Chartered IIA and has been working in the internal audit and related professions for over 25 years. In this webinar, Anne is going to explore the new mandatory topical requirements, and the presentation will last around an hour, and we'll also try to squeeze in some questions in there as well. If you are an ACCA member, and this webinar will count towards your verifiable CBD if it's relevant to your career. If you have any questions during the webinar, then please use the Q&A function, which is at the top of the screen, to submit your questions. Also, feel free to use the chat function to leave any comments and engage with your fellow delegates. And I think that's everything from me. I will now hand over to Anne.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Hello, everybody. I am Anne from the Chartered IIA. I am just going to share some slides, which you will be able to have access to after the session. So if anybody can just give me a thumbs up or anything, a reaction, just to say you can see the slide okay. Just to make sure the tech is working. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Pat. So I'm here today to talk about the topical requirements that are mandatory for internal audit. And hopefully I'm going to allay some fears around this. I am not going to talk through kind of the individual topical requirements and what they say. The whole purpose of this is to talk about how to apply them. So how to use the processes that you already have and embed these into those to hopefully reduce any of that feared admin burden that will come along with these. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve by the end of the session, that you walk away feeling a little bit less fraught about what these are about, how on earth are we going to fit these into overly stretched resources in our teams. So, I've lost where my cursor is. There we go. So, one thing I wanted to talk about, first of all, is for the public sector. So I don't know if there are people on the call from the public sector, but this is worth mentioning and just highlighting if you are. If you're not public sector, these are automatically mandatory. Okay, so that's just something to put there. If you are in the UK public sector, then the topical requirements actually go through a review process as each one is published by the Internal Audit Standards Advisory Board for the UK public sector. So for the RIAS, the relevant internal audit standards setters. And what we do is each time one is published for consultation, the board gets together and we go through the consultation documents and have a look at them, and then pull together feedback to send to the global IIA, very much with a view of, kind of where there might be challenges for the UK public sector in how they're written or what they're saying, and so on. So we participate in that feedback process. When the topical requirement is then finalised, the Internal Audit Standards Advisory Board will also review the final version that's published and go through that again, looking, are there any challenges or problems with using these in the UK public sector? There are three decisions that are then made. Either they are absolutely fine as they are to use in the UK public sector. They are not fine as they are, and where the UK public sector should not adopt these at all, and we should, they are not going to be mandatory in the UK public sector. Or they are mandatory, but there are some little tweaks or little things that are applicable and we need to consider and use, or we need to replace that little part with this, and so on. So it's a bit like having an application note for that particular topical requirement. So those are the kind of three decisions. The topical requirements become mandatory 12 months after they're published in final. So the Internal Audit Standards Board do that very quickly, the next meeting after they are published, and kind of try and get that decision out fairly quickly so that the sector knows what's going on and what the decision is. So I just wanted to put that there, as well as some information for any of you who are in the UK public sector about them being mandatory and what that review process is, because I think that's quite important. So where are we at? In this 2025, we have the cybersecurity that was published in final in February. So that is effective for everybody, including UK public sector, from February 2026. The third party topical requirement was published in final in September. So that will be effective from September 2026. The UK Public Sector Internal Audit Standards Advisory Board hasn't reviewed that yet. We've got that at our next meeting before Christmas, so hopefully there'll be a decision coming out in that soon. And you'll be able to have a look at that and see what that is. I can't preempt what that decision will be because I haven't discussed it with any of the other members of the board at this point. Organisational behaviour has gone through consultation. That is due to be published in final in December. So that will then become effective potentially December next year or January of 2027. And then business resiliency or organisation resiliency is currently in consultation. That consultation closes on the 17th of November, so 13 days to go. The consultation periods are always 6 weeks. So if you want to feed into that consultation, please do. Simply go to Global IIA's website, put topical requirements in the search at the top. You'll land on the right page, and it's there with all the documents and the survey to give your feedback. We do ask anybody and everybody to give feedback. The more voices we have coming from UK and Ireland on this, the louder our voices into that consultation process. So please, please, please do have a look at that one and feed into that process. What I do at the Chartered IIA, I gather and we have focus groups that look at these, and I collect all that feedback, and I have a one-to-one conversation with the global standards team at Global IIA to feed all that in. So that comes through there. I also sit on the International Internal Audit Standards Board at Global IIA as well, and they all come through there prior to being published in final. So I actually do see that the feedback we give is actually addressed and taken into account. Not all of it, but I do see changes that are improvements that address some of the feedback that we give. So please do. That consultation period is there to actually hear the member voice and listen. In next year, we've got 3 on the cards for coming out for consultation: anti-corruption and bribery, people management, and fraud risk management. So those are the 3. So those will not be effective until 2027, even 2028, depending on when they're published in final. And it normally takes 6 months from the start of the consultation right through to final publication. So that gives you some idea of the timescales as well. So hopefully what you're seeing here is this isn't that there's going to be, we've done 4 this year, but we're going to do 20 next year. That is not the plan at all. These are steady, coming out at a really steady pace. So just want to reassure you on that, because that I know is a concern for some. So I'm just going to pause there. There's no questions in the Q&A. There's nothing in the chat. So I will carry on at this point, but do feel free to put your questions in there or any comments that you want to raise as we go along, and I will pause regularly to pick them up. Okay, so the purpose. I think it's really important that before we go into applying them, that we understand the context of what these are about and what they're for. They're there to provide a baseline for any internal audit work, assurance work that we do, but particularly audit engagement work. They're mandatory for audit engagements. If you're doing an advisory piece, they're recommended to be used and looked at, but they are not mandatory. So if you're doing a piece of work that isn't on the audit plan, then you don't need to worry about these. This is very much connected to a mandatory for things that are on your audit plan and the type of engagement that you're doing as well. They are targeted at common high risk areas. And one of the drivers or pieces of information that kind of informs what's on the list is risk in focus. So if you see that report, you look at the ranking of risks in there, you'll see that the ones we've been doing this year are very aligned to that. Cybersecurity has been the top #1 risk for several years, so it was the first one that was done. We'll also, culture has been quite high in concerns, and that's where organisational behaviour has come in. So you can see that. We've also seen supply chain and third-party risk bubbling away and being impacted by quite a lot of things, and impact due to things like geopolitical risk and so on. And so that's why that's been picked. So the list is driven by what organisations are saying are high priority risk areas for their organisations. That said, what you won't find is a topical requirement on AI. AI is very much an emerging area. There is no common or established practice yet for how to provide assurance on AI. There are absolutely organisations that are forging ahead and doing work in that, but there are a lot more that aren't. And until that common practice kind of establishes and common control frameworks establishes and embedded in, you won't find something on this. With things that are emerging, like hot topic risks that are emerging, you'll find that Global IIA will do guidance first to kind of give a steer on what they're seeing and hearing. It only becomes mandatory once things settle down. So you won't see things like AI, you won't see quantum computing, you won't see those emerging technologies as the subject of a topical requirement until they become more mainstream. They apply and you need to use them when you have an engagement that's on the audit plan, either in its name in its own right, so a cybersecurity audit, you pick up the cybersecurity topical requirement. But you also might say, be doing a payroll audit, you're looking at the software, and as part of the planning that engagement, you want to look at the cyber risk attached to that software. So then you would pick up the cybersecurity topical requirement. That doesn't mean you have to do everything that's in that topical requirement, okay? That's where we come into the partial world. So that's where they apply. And like I say, it's about assurance work. It's not about advisory work, consultancy work, that kind of engagement. They're set into three main areas: governance, risk management, and internal control. You see audit objectives under each of those headings. That's so it aligns to our purpose and also the opinion. We're required in an engagement to give an opinion on governance, risk management, and internal control. So again, it's just kind of grouping them in a way that kind of really marries with what's in the standards more widely, and so on and so forth. We do have to provide evidence or document why we're not covering something in a topical requirement. And I know that's where a lot of people have got concerns. And people have also got concerns about, because there is a topical requirement, that you've got to do an audit in that area. And that is absolutely not the case and not the intention of Global IIA. So I'm just going to pause there about the purpose before I go into into audit planning. So this is annual audit planning. There's nothing in the QA. There's no hands up. There's nothing in the chat. So I will continue, but please do, any questions, just pop them in. So Global IIA has been really clear that because there's a topical requirement, that does not mean you need to audit it every year, they're not trying to give you your audit plan. Your audit plan is still driven by your risk-based assessment, okay, of your organisation. The fact that a topical requirement exists does not impact on that decision. You still do a risk-based audit planning. That is still there, okay? And actually, if you look at the Global Internal Audit Standards, and in particular Standard 9.4, it doesn't mention the word topical requirement anywhere in it, okay? And you can actually conform and hit full achievement of the Global Internal Audit Standards without using the topical requirements. They are quite standalone and separate. I think the word topical requirement appears 3 times in the global standards, and that's in the introduction. So you haven't, they're not embedded and the wording's not in there in that sense. So your risk-based annual audit planning, just the same, that drives what audits engagements you do for whatever period that planning is for. But what I do want to highlight is how actually the topical requirements are aligned to the global standards and where the connection is, and how they actually assist and help in meeting the global internal audit standards. So standard 9.4 talks about the internal audit plan must consider coverage of information technology governance, fraud risk, the effectiveness of the organisation's compliance and ethics programmes, and other high-risk areas. So we know that topical requirements are baseline for typical high-risk areas in an organisation. So this is where they fit in and they align to what's in the standards. That actually using the topical requirements, you're already required to consider their coverage through this standard. So that's how they kind of link in. Now, of course, you can do it without using the topical requirements and still meet that standard, but they dovetail and they are consistent with the standards. It also says in there that we must communicate timely to the board and senior management, aka audit committee, the rationale for not including an assurance engagement in a high-risk area or activity in the plan. And again, that is what the topical requirements say. Because this is a high-risk area, you need to explain to the audit committee if you are not covering it in your audit plan. So it's not adding anything that isn't already in the standards. So it's just that they're more visible. And here's a list of typical high-risk areas. So it's really important to understand that the topical requirements are adding to the requirements in the standards. They actually help and support you being able to meet the standards, and you still follow the same processes that you would for your risk-based planning. So one of the things that we've been hearing, and we had a lot of feedback when the first one came out, the cybersecurity and what have you. There's a huge amount of pushback in Europe, the UK, Ireland, North America, Australia, a lot of pushback on why these are being made mandatory. And we had conversations with Global, believe you me, we had lots of conversations with Global about this. They are a global professional body, and whilst when you work in a very mature part of the world in terms of the internal audit profession, you don't need these. We're doing this because we are establishing what that common and good practice looks like. We're already living and breathing it. But in other parts of the world, they aren't. And they really, really need these to be mandatory so that when they go and do assurance for their government or their organisations or whoever they are working for, that they have this stick that they can use to drive up the standard of the work that they can do in order to provide better assurance. So whilst we may think we don't need these, we don't need them to be mandatory, this is global. This is a global piece of mandatory work. So it's that's why they've remained mandatory, because there's a huge part of our profession that aren't in the fortunate circumstances we are of having mature control frameworks in our organisations, and that we're auditing these at a really, really good level already. It's there to help them and bring them up to our level, which is only really good for our profession, and then we can move up to the next level together. So that's the reason why they're mandatory. But what that then caused as well, some of that feedback was, but that means we've got to do extra work. We've now got to document this, kind of why we're not using them. And we've got, it's just going to add loads of admin. They're going to become quite tick boxy, they're not adding any value. Fair comment. We look at them, when we sit down for the Public Sector Internal Audit Standards Board, we sit there and go, is this going to do any harm if we adopt it? And if you start taking that approach and looking at it and thinking, will this do any harm with it being there and us putting it into an audit or using it in some way? And I think you'll probably find the answer is no. Is it going to be insightful? No. Is it going to add anything more? Probably, maybe not. But there are some ways that they can actually help. And if you see them as a tool, it can be really, really helpful, particularly to trainees or if you're auditing something for the first time. But I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I want to talk first about the annual audit planning and this requirement to talk about, we're not going to audit, we're not doing any assurance work in connection with this topical requirement, because actually we can start making some of those decisions as part of the annual audit planning. It doesn't need to be in every engagement. And there may well be, particularly at the moment, lots of engagements on your audit plans that don't have a topical requirement that's relevant to them. That will build over time. But at the moment, there's probably, we've only got 2 in final, and then neither of them are effective yet. But what I'm encouraging people to do is think about when you're developing your annual audit plan, you do a risk assessment. You'll assess your risks. You may assess under a structure of an audit universe or a risk universe or what have you. However you're doing that does not change, but what you can now do is map the topical requirements to those universes. So you'll see on screen there that I've got a risk of cyber attack, and this is very straightforward and simple just for illustration. And obviously, if you've got a risk of cyber risk in your risk and you're reviewing it for your annual audit plan, then the topical requirement that's relevant is the cybersecurity one. So you're flagging here or just noting that, well, this topical requirement could well be relevant to this audit engagement if it makes it onto the plan. There may be some secondary. So I've put on there the third party one might be relevant because there could be some things in there. There is overlap, these topical requirements across organisation. So there might be some secondary ones. Organisational behaviour, if we think about Marks and Spencer's and the cyber attack, that was social engineering. That was something in the third party that happened that led to that. So again, you can think about that. And it's just at this point a mapping to say that, if we're going to do an audit focusing on cyber risk, these are potentially the relevant topical requirements we might need to pull in. And at that point, you may have an idea of what the scope of that audit might be. And again, it might be, okay, so I'm going to look at cyber risk, but I'm going to look at the governance only. So now you're going, okay, it's the cybersecurity, but it's only the governance part. So you can actually kind of go to that level if you want as you move through. But that mapping and embedding it into, you're still doing your risk assessment in exactly the same way, but you're now flagging and just having that thought process within there. That's all the documentation you need, because your risk assessment justifies why something is or is not in scope of your audit plan. You don't need to do anything extra because it's still a risk-based decision as to what goes on your audit plan. So please think about how you can map and rely on that risk-based decision and that process for developing your audit plan as part of that justification and the evidence, because you'll have it all documented because it all goes to audit committee. You might not put the risk assessment itself in front of audit committee, but you put the plan, which is connected to the risk assessment that you've got. So think about that. Think about how you can embed it. And that's what I'm encouraging people to think about and do. And it's also what Global are doing. They have published I think it's about 15 pages of guidance on how to implement these. And this is definitely part of that. And you're then going to submit your papers to the audit committee with your plan on. You'll talk about your methodology, and you can talk about there. And again, you might make reference to, this might include some coverage of this topical requirement, because until you get to the engagement, you really don't know. You don't know for certainty. So this is part of that process, that step. And actually, by doing it here, you can already say, well, we're not covering that topical requirement, and this is why. So it's gone, it's done. You've got evidence. Now, it might come back as it's identified as part of an engagement that's on the plan, and you've not thought of that in the scope at this point. but you're explaining, you're taking them on that journey. And then the audit committee approve the paperwork, or you'll have further conversations. It'll be minuted, so it's all there. The only thing that I am suggesting is that in the papers that go to the audit committee, when the audit plan is put to them, is that you do something, and I've put some wording on screen, something that just kind of summarises the position in regard to topical requirements. So you can see I've just simply put the following lists for each effective topical requirement. So not the ones that aren't live yet, just the ones that are mandatory. For each effective topical requirement, the audit engagement proposed on the audit plan, where these may be used as part/all of the scope. So, you don't have to cover everything in a topical requirement. You absolutely do not. And I don't think many people will cover everything in a topical requirement in one audit. So, I just don't think that will work for the size of them. So then I simply put cybersecurity topical requirement. We're going to do an IT security audit, and we're going to focus on governance and risk management. Procurement contracting, we're going to focus on the controls in the cybersecurity. So you can see we've got coverage in cybersecurity on 3 aspects, but in different audits and maybe with a narrow focus. And then the third party topical requirement, again, the same audit, procurement, contracting, but in there we're going to look at risk management and controls. We're not going to look at governance. And then from that list, I've then highlighted, as a result, no assurance over third party governance is being proposed for the coming year. And I've just explained why. So I've just put some words together. And in this case, it's because we've had assurance from elsewhere, which has been really good. And there are no key changes proposed and what have you. And remember, it reflects our plan. So this is what is at that point in time. It doesn't mean to say that it can't be picked up later. So that's kind of where it is. And that's the evidence that the topical requirement. You've got your risk assessment, map them in there. So as you're doing that risk assessment, you're automatically justifying your choices as to why topical requirements are being used and not. And then you've got your whole pack for your audit committee and your minutes that you present that actually pulls all this together. And obviously this last wording is in particular meeting that standard 9.2 or whatever it was, 9.4, where it talked about you need to explain what you're not covering in your plan for your high risk areas. And you can use topical requirements as part of that. So that's where we've kind of said for audit planning. I'm going to pause there. I'm very conscious I'm talking at you. It's like, I've been online. So I'm just going to pause there and just see if there are any questions. I can't see anything in the chat. I can't see anything in the Q&A. And I can't see any hands up or anything. So I'm guessing everybody's still on the journey with me and everything's okay. And everything's making sense. But please do, if there's anything you want to ask, please do. Okay, so I'm going to move on to internal audit engagements. So as I said, you only need to use a topical requirement in an internal audit engagement. You don't need to use them in advisory work. And of course, like I've already said, when you get to start planning the audit engagement and you get to that point, the scope that was intended when it was put on the audit plan for the year, it might be when you get to the actual engagement itself, that scope is changed or moves or narrows or changes in some way, shape or form. And that is absolutely fine. And the reason that it moves is because you do a risk assessment. And again, it's the risk assessment that decides what you cover in your engagement, not what's in the topical requirement. You still do risk-based auditing. This isn't a push to move to compliance auditing using a topical requirement. You still do your risk assessment based on loads of information that you still pull from your client, from the external environment, etc., etc. But what you may now also use as part of that information gathering is the topical requirement. Because in essence, particularly in the user guide, it provides a list of suggested controls and what they might look like and how they might work. So when you come to do the control evaluation piece, it can actually provide a benchmark for you to use to look at what controls in place and look at the design of them. So this is where they become much more of a tool rather than something that's mandatory, and using it as that approach. Some of them, like the cybersecurity, it's mapped to 2 frameworks of NIST, I think COBIT as well. There are others. I've got another one from CIIA Australia are doing work in this area. They've done a mapping to another standard for something or other, which I need to pick up on and have a look at. So if you're following NIST or COBIT in your organisation and you're auditing that, well, you've got the mapping here straight away. It's already done for you. So, kind of these do dovetail into, and they do try to provide as much of that helpful mapping in the user guide as possible. But think of them as a tool to assist with the engagement planning. So I went back to the standards again, and I just pulled out 3 where I thought that actually they really are a kind of something that we can use as a tool, not just in that information gathering stage to help assess the design of the control framework for the area you're auditing, but also in other ways. So 13.2 is the risk assessment, and that internal auditors need to gather applicable frameworks, guidance and other criteria that can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of those processes. And like I say, a topical requirement can be classed as a framework, guidance. There's a user guide. Yes, the mandatory bits are in there as well, but you can think of it in that way, in that fashion. 13.3 talks about articulating the purpose of the engagement and describing the specific goals, and so on. Sometimes that can be really difficult to articulate, to write audit objectives. And again, the topical requirements, the mandatory bits are audit objectives. Now, some of them are very long, a couple of sentences, so you might not want to do that. But again, it might give you some ideas and some help and support in doing that. So, they're written to in as clear English as we can get, considering it's a global, it's got to be read globally. So it has to be very succinct and to the point and really clear. And it goes through a massive editing and proofreading process as well. So, so again, it can help rather than be a hindrance. And then when you're doing an audit, you have to agree with senior management the criteria that will be used to evaluate everything that you're going to test and so on. You can adopt the criteria that management already have, but if you're not happy with them, then you need to agree a set of criteria. And again, you can use the topical requirement as those criteria, and you can explain to them, we're using these not because they're mandatory, but because they've been through such a rigorous development process across the world. And this is a worldwide benchmark. This is a worldwide used by the internal audit profession across the world. And remember, global membership is 245,000. It's not a small organisation. And there's been input from stakeholders and academic experts into all of these. So it isn't just internal audit going, oh, I know, we'll do that. There's a lot of input into those. So there's a lot of credibility around them as a benchmark that you can use. So they think of them as a tool, think of them as a checklist, think of them as helping. If you've never done the audit before, here's an aide-memoire of what you might want to look at in this particular area. Here's if you've got a trainee and they want to know more about cybersecurity, get them to read the topical requirement, get them to do a presentation on what's in there. It's a really valuable source of information for that that you can use for CPD and for personal development as well. So really think of it along that way. But as I've said with the annual audit planning, you've still got to evidence what you are and are not covering in the engagement for the topical requirement. And it's just the same approach. For every engagement, you do a risk assessment. So map the audit objectives into your risk and control matrix for the engagement. Put in the audit objectives, the control objectives, as the expected or a benchmark, and you can then, and that will be now be mapped to the risks. So your risk assessment then goes, I'm going to look at that risk but not that risk. Your risk assessment is the justification why you're not looking at that audit objective. Okay, so it's the same approach, but we're just going now down to audit objective level. So in cybersecurity, I think there are 17 audit objectives in total. But think the audit planning. So if the audit plan is we're going to do a governance audit of cybersecurity risk, you've already discounted the risk management and internal control ones. You've only got to look at the governance piece, because the rationale for not doing that is in the audit plan. Okay, so in the engagement, you've only got to look at the governance objectives and put them in. Okay, so think about how you can do that and embedding those in that way, so that you're automatically collecting that evidence rather than doing the risk assessment and then go, right, now I've got to map it over here. I've got to fill in this document over here. Okay, so embed is what I'm trying to say. So in the working paper, so this is another point as well. You know, kind of your risk assessment is absolutely the documentation and the evidence you need for that rationale. You do need to put in your terms of engagement, or what internal engagement brief, whatever you call it, what you're not covering, what's not in scope, which we do, but you don't need to use the language of the topical requirements. You know, you use that language in your working papers for internal audit purposes, but when it comes to client-facing stuff, if using language of topical requirements is going to confuse things, you don't need to put it in there because it's in your topic, in your working papers. So think about, you know, kind of what you're not covering, but put it in a language that the audit client will understand. You don't need to revert and pull through what's in the topical requirement and use that language. You don't even have to mention to the client that a topical requirement exists if you don't, if it doesn't work, and you don't need to. So, you know, this is for us as a profession to use to help us benchmark the work and the assurance we provide against a global standard. So yeah, so just you don't need to over use these, particularly in a client environment. So I'm going to pause there. Again, just check, still nothing in the Q&A, nothing in the chat, and no hands raised. So I think we're good to move on. We've nearly finished. If you do have some questions, you know, think on, because we've got plenty of time left. Yeah. So quality assessments. So one of the things that's a very unknown yet, and the internal audit profession don't know yet, is how is this going to impact on an external quality assessment, or indeed, how am I going to do this in an internal self-assessment, because it needs to be pulled into there. So I don't anticipate, so we have an EQA service, so which I head up, and I'm already thinking ahead to when these come into place. The first one comes into play in January, February next year. And what we are not anticipating in introducing additional tests or additional things to look at topical requirements, because we truly believe that we are absolutely encouraging that people embed these, that you don't have a separate piece of work. So, you know, when you're doing your internal quality self-assessment, you are looking for evidence that things have been done the way they should. So conformance, performance of the standards, and also of the topical requirements. So you would be looking for, and we will be looking for in the audit planning, is there evidence of the topical requirements being considered? And is there evidence of which are anticipated to be covered over the course of the plan? That's what we're looking for. Where's the evidence that supports that? So your annual risk assessment, if you've mapped them, that is the evidence. Okay, so it's not looking for where's your folder on topical requirements. It's not looking for, you know, extra stuff. We would certainly be wanting, we'd have a conversation, but we would also then be looking for it to be embedded, because that's, let's be honest, bolt-ons make them administratively burdensome. And the rationale for not having something in the plan is your risk assessment for both audit planning and for the engagement. And that's why in the engagements as well, so if we're picking an assurance engagement, not an advisory engagement, an assurance engagement, is the right topical requirement being considered at that planning stage, and is there evidence of each objective being considered? And again, if it was cybersecurity governance audit, we would only be looking at that governance section. We won't be looking at the risk in it. Have you evidence why you're not doing them? No, that's in the annual audit planning part. I don't need to put that in the engagement because it's up there. So that's we will be looking at as part of the FAR review, just alongside what we do already. So we don't envisage EQAs challenging decisions on whether or not to include a specific audit objective from a topical requirement, because that's a risk-based decision. Okay, that's auditor's judgment. That is based on the work that you're doing. We're looking for conformance and performance. So we don't anticipate EQA assessors saying, well, you've done a cybersecurity governance audit, why haven't you done a cybersecurity controls audit? Well, that's in the annual audit planning. We won't be looking at that in the FAR review. And okay, so, but we've already gone through the planning process, the audit planning process, and how the audit plan's been delivered, and the process there, and how that aligns with the organisation's strategic objectives. It's the right plan for the organisation. The fact that there's a topical requirement does not change those decisions. So that's why we're saying we won't be challenging those if you're following, because risk-based is the mainstay. So some suggestions and some takeaways for you to kind of go away and think about and have a look at. The first one is review your methodology for the annual audit planning and for your engagement planning, and think about how do you embed them. It can be if you're using, I'll come on to that in a moment. So how do you embed them? And obviously you've got to train this in as well. Test your methodology. None of them are live yet. February next year, we've got time to play and to have a go. So think about, you know, how are you going to do this? Have a go in an engagement. You know, if you've got a payroll audit and you're looking at the payroll software, just think about, okay, so this is the risk assessment. Let's pick up that cybersecurity. Let's look at the internal control section, because that's the section that's relevant to payroll here. Okay, so those controls, how do those map into the risks? Are they all aligned to one risk that's on this, or am I doing here? How does that all work? And just have a go, because it's only by using and playing that we kind of find the right methodology, and then you can train it out. It doesn't matter now. They're not mandatory yet. So have a play, and play. The idea is to develop a process that works. If you're using internal audit software, so you've got an external vendor supplying, or you've developed your own, now is the time to have a look and ask the question, how is the process going to embed topical requirements, that automated process? If it's an external vendor, I always encourage people to be beta testers for key changes, because then you have a real say on what they're doing. And how that evolves and how that process changes. And it also develops that relationship with them as well. Plus you get to know, and you're ready and up and running with that new software solution as soon as it kind of gets launched. So that could be a really good idea to kind of, if you've got the time and the resources. No, for many that won't be the case. But the internal audit software only gets to what we need it to be by us being involved. If you're more of a Microsoft Office, you've got your own templates. Again, look at how you can add to them. You know, if you're doing a documented risk assessment, is it just a case of adding an extra column in where you slip in, these are my topical requirements? What words do you want to put in there? what makes sense to you as an organisation? Or do you have an audit universe? Do you want to map them to the audit universe instead? Where do you put them in, and where do you map them? And it can be as simple, keep it simple. Embrace them as a tool. We are guilty of going, well, they don't add any insight, they don't add any benefit, they can. And that's about a bit of a mindset change and thinking about, okay, so, this is, maybe we do some training sessions around them. Maybe we put it into an AI and create a podcast for everybody to listen to that explains what the cybersecurity topical requirement is saying. Maybe, we embrace it in some way, shape or form that kind of normalizes them as part of our toolkit. We've got templates. Maybe these are, kind of part of that toolkit now. And lastly, please, last plea, please participate in the consultations. They are so important. I do have the pre-final version of the organisational behaviour one in my inbox at the moment. I haven't read it yet. I don't know how much that will have changed from the draft. But that was, I know, because our president co-authored that one. That was really challenging to write, and there are a lot of new concepts and ideas in there. And so it'll be interesting to see how much that has changed through the consultation process. But that is on track to be published in about a month's time. So we'll see that. But if we don't participate, we can't know when they don't look like nice for us, is what I always think. So do participate. And that is it from me. So we've finished a little bit early through the slides. I'm just going to go back again. There's nothing in Q&A. Oh, there's something in chat. So we'll go to the chat. Hi, really great learning and presentation. Will the slides be shared? Yes, I'm guessing they will be. ACCA have the slides. So yeah. Yeah, and Pat's put, great to hear there is flexibility. My closing comment, and I say this every time I talk through this and do a session on this, my closing comment is they are not, it is mandatory to consider them. It is not mandatory to do every audit objective every year. There is absolute flexibility, and it's down to the risks of your organisation that drive what you provide assurance on, not the existence and content of a topical requirement. Okay, so just as, and I hope I've reassured you on that point, this isn't a case of trying to push out every audit team needs to audit this in this way. That is absolutely not what this is about. It's about trying to set a global standard for auditing particular risks, which are common and high risk, like cyber. Okay, so there's nothing else coming through. Oh, how does the external audit recommendations affect the internal audit plan? Obviously, that's a bit separate to topical requirements, but I think it's another source of information that you will build into your annual audit risk assessment. I know when I was a head of audit, I would have the management letter and the recommendations that would come out there. And depending on what they were, whether they were high priority or what have you, that then might influence my risk assessment of those particular processes that were impacted or those recommendations were relevant to. And that's what I would do. So it would be one of the sources of information to input into the risk assessment. And I think that's it, Sophie. I can't see any more questions or hands up.
No, I don't think so. Just checked the Q&A, nothing. Has anybody got any final comments? Obviously, if you want to raise your hand, I can take you off mute as well if you want to say anything. If not, Anne, thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your insights with us. And thanks to everyone who's logged on and listened. I have put a link below because Anne will be joining us again next week on the 12th of November. Looking at external quality assessments for internal audit. So please do register if you haven't already. Oh, we have got a hand up. Maybe we can take a quick question. Is that okay, Anne, before?
Yes, absolutely. Claire.
Claire, I think you should be able to come off mute now. No, maybe that was a, oh, no, it wasn't.
No, sorry.
That's fine.
That's fine.
Yeah, so if you haven't already, please do register for Anne's session next week. I put that in the chat, and there will be an on-demand version available shortly. So I'll ensure to share the link with everyone once it's live. And as Anne said, I'll also share the presentation slides as well. But thank you all so much and hope you have lovely afternoons. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great
Thanks all.
day. Bye.